You're watching live from Paris here on France 24. Glad you could join us. These are our headlines this hour. Changing the constitution that was put in place under Augusto Pinochet. Chileans vote in favour of reform and call for greater equality in the country. Block roads, empty your bank account, strike. Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya calls for a day of nationwide action to increase pressure on President Alexander Lukashenko. And calling for the army to be brought in to set up field hospitals in the south of France. Healthcare systems struggling to cope with the number of patients from COVID-19 who need care. Well, choosing to draft a new charter to the country's constitution, voters in Chile back plans to scrap guiding principles that were put in place back under the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. The ballot was prompted after widespread protest demanding better pensions, education and healthcare for all. Selena Sykes tells us more.
Fireworks, music and partying in the streets of Santiago as Chileans celebrate the beginning of a new era. The population has overwhelmingly voted to replace the constitution left behind by the regime of Augusto Pinochet, seen by many as underpinning the country's glaring inequalities. As the news broke, thousands of people flocked to the capital's Plaza Italia, the epicenter of anti-government protests that erupted last year.
El cimiento de todo y vamos a seguir adelante, vamos a seguir luchando con esto, siempre. La verdad es que yo creo que todos los chilenos tenemos muchas aspiraciones, esperamos mucho de este cambio, pero por sobre todo lo principal es la dignidad. Yo creo que logramos la dignidad que tanto buscábamos.
In a speech acknowledging the results, President Sebastián Pinera called on Chileans to come together.
Para acordar una nueva constitución para Chile. Hasta ahora, la Constitución nos ha dividido. A partir de hoy, todos debemos colaborar para que la nueva Constitución sea el gran marco de unidad.
Chile's conservative government agreed with the centre-left opposition to allow the referendum after social unrest broke out last year. Chileans voted in favour of having the new constitution drafted by a convention of 155 citizens, instead of one that would also include lawmakers. Elected by April 2021, members will have 1 year to agree on a text, which will have to be approved by a two-thirds majority. Chileans will then vote again on whether they accept the new constitution.
Colombian security forces have killed, they say, a top member of the National Liberation Army, the rebel commander known best for his nom de guerre, Uriel. The National Liberation Army has still around 2,000 fighters. Peace talks between it and the government fell apart after a car bombing in the capital last year. Block the roads, shut down workplaces. Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya is calling on supporters to paralyse the country with nationwide strike action. A bid to continue to increase pressure on President Alexander Lukashenko to go. We speak now to our correspondent Gulliver Cragg to tell us more about the strike, and he gives us an idea of the level of support for the opposition movement.
I was at the Minsk tractor works at the moment the 7 a.m. shift was about to start and people were flocking to work as per usual. The overwhelming majority of them did not want to speak to me at all. A few people who I spoke to said that they did not want to strike. One person, though, cried out, "Long live Belarus," which is the cry of the opposition, as he was going into the factory. And I said, "Why aren't you striking?" And he said, "I will later." A couple of other people said that they were going to strike later on. And one man agreed to speak to me for a bit longer. He said he was already on strike and he thought that 80% of workers at the factory supported the idea of strike action, but that it's very hard for people to strike with a lack of proper independent trade unions, lack of any support structure, and a very real risk of losing your job and your revenue if you go on strike. Now, just now I saw a video posted online of workers inside the grounds of that factory doing the rounds and recruiting more people to join the strike. They were supposed to come out at 8 a.m. according to one announcement that was made. That didn't happen, but I could see a small group inside the grounds of the factory, though I couldn't go in to actually talk to them. But it looked like a very small group, but now on this video it looks as though that group is getting bigger. But the general feeling is that only a part of the workers of these large state-owned factories in Belarus will have the courage to go on strike because the pressure is too big on them to lose their revenues. The risk is too big.
Oliver Cragg there speaking to us earlier on. Well, over 52,000 new cases confirmed in the last 24-hour tally. France continuing to see the number of COVID-19 patients increase at a rapid rate. 17% of people getting tested for the virus now testing positive. The numbers needing hospital care also on the rise. Over 2,500 people currently in intensive care units. The country's health system being stretched to its limits, with the army being called in to build field hospitals again in certain areas. Carrie Scarland tells us more.
The intensive care unit of this hospital in Saint-Étienne is on the brink of saturation. This patient arrived Saturday after going to the emergency room.
Il a 36 ans. C'est quand même particulier d'avoir quelqu'un d'aussi jeune et en général, ils ont des antécédents connus en fait.
There are 30 beds in total, all reserved for COVID patients and almost all are full. For the head of the department, there's less and less room to move.
Notre inquiétude est d'arriver au moment où on aura beaucoup plus de patients à admettre en réanimation que des lits de réanimation. Et on voit ce moment arriver vers fin octobre, début novembre.
The situation is tense in all hospitals in the Loire department and not just in intensive care. It's prompted 21 mayors in the south of the department to write a letter to the French government asking to call in the army. The mayor of Saint-Chamond, one of the signatories of the letter, says there's no time to waste.
Nos hôpitaux aujourd'hui maîtrisent la situation, mais ils sont au bout de ce qu'ils peuvent supporter.
This spring, a military field hospital with 30 intensive care beds was set up in Mulhouse in eastern France. For the regional health agency, such reinforcement is unnecessary.
L'heure n'est pas à faire appel à un tel dispositif. Nous n'en avons pas à l'heure actuelle besoin. Mais si, par exemple, la situation se dégradait dans les 3 semaines qui viennent ou dans un futur indéterminé, il faudra reconsidérer tout ça. Mais nous n'y sommes pas à l'heure actuelle.
To take some pressure off the hospitals in the Loire, all non-urgent operations have been postponed, while some patients are set to be transferred to other regions less affected by the pandemic.
Well, Belgium, meanwhile, is divided over how to handle COVID-19. Brussels and 5 francophone provinces have put in ever stricter measures to try and reduce the spread of the virus, going further than the national government advice on the issue. Curfews put in place earlier in the day, working from home made mandatory where possible, and all museums, churches and gyms and the like closed. For the president of the Brussels region, there's no time to waste.
We had to be more strict. Why? Because Brussels is a city. We have to prevent our citizens from visiting their neighbors or going to see their friends. Midnight is too late. That's why a curfew starting at 10 p.m. is better. People will stay at home, and that's better. Wearing a mask everywhere in Brussels is also very important. It sends a signal to our citizens.
Well, our correspondent in Brussels, Dave Keating, tells us more about the restrictions there and how indeed they differ from the national advice given.
The measures taking effect today here in Brussels go further than what was announced nationally on Friday. We did kind of have a strange back and forth here over the weekend because on Friday the government announced that it wasn't going to majorly increase restrictions despite the very rapidly growing caseload here. The Brussels region didn't like that, and so on Saturday they came out with this announcement that they would be having the restrictions go much further here in the capital. As you mentioned, gyms, pools, museums, theaters, all have to close. There's a masks everywhere ordinance that you have to wear masks everywhere out on the street. And also the curfew will be earlier, 10 p.m. Now, this is in response to the fact that the caseload here in Brussels is particularly bad. For all of the French-speaking part of Belgium, actually, together, Wallonia and Brussels are the worst affected region at the moment in Europe. But Belgium as a whole isn't looking too good either. We are approaching 15,000 cases a day here and 500 hospitalizations. We're getting up to numbers that has the government very, very concerned. And this is looking very, very much like the numbers that we were seeing in the spring. And now the big thing that they're worried about is the hospital capacity. And again, here in Brussels, that's not looking great. They've stopped any non-essential surgeries in the hospital here because they want to make sure that the hospitals are free for an increase that they're expecting in hospitalizations.
Well, there are now just days to go to presidential elections in Ivory Coast. Alassane Ouattara is running for a third term, but many say that is unconstitutional. The opposition is calling for a boycott of the vote and for civil disobedience, a call that has prompted some politicians to go out on their own as independent candidates. Well, all this week we'll be meeting with those running for the top office. Today, affectionately known as KKB, Koudelio Konan Bertin is the youngest man in the race. He's hoping to capture the youth vote. Our correspondents Sam Bradpeace and Thias Brook take us to meet him.
Night had fallen by the time the youngest candidate made his appearance. Koudelio Konan Bertin, nicknamed Kakabe, met with a few hundred young people. He thinks that at 52 years old, he has a good chance of capturing the youth vote in a population where 2/3 of the people are younger than 25.
C'est de vous mobiliser tous les jeunes de Côte d'Ivoire derrière ma candidature pour que nous puissions chasser Alassane Ouattara le 31.
He casts himself as an alternative to the three men that have governed since the 90s, all of whom are over 75.
On ne va pas nous manipuler éternellement comme ça. Qu'est-ce qu'on nous propose? Qu'est-ce qu'on nous donne? La guerre des échos. Bédié, Gbagbo, Ouattara, Bédié, Gbagbo, Ouattara. Et quand on va se lever, les pro-Gbagbo, les pro-Bédié, les pro-Ouattara.
This sentiment hits the nail on the head for some.
Il faudrait qu'on ait un président jeune qui pourra aider la jeunesse, qui pourra nous aider à travailler.
Only Ouattara and Kakabe are actually campaigning. The other two candidates are boycotting the electoral process. His detractors accuse him of being manipulated by the president, receiving payments to make the race seem credible.
Ils le disent sans jamais apporter les preuves. C'est du mépris. C'est ce qui les caractérise. Le chien peut aboyer, la caravane Kakabe avance.
Having split from the PDCI, many in his former party consider him a traitor. He now risks splitting their vote. When he ran for president in 2015, less than 4% cast their ballot for Kakabe. He will clearly be looking to do better this time around.
Thailand's parliament is meeting to discuss months of protests in the country. The largest opposition party calling for the Prime Minister now to resign, echoing demands from the student-led demonstrations that have been ongoing for months. Those on the street also want to see a new constitution put in place. James Wilson reports.
Demonstrations against the government are fast becoming a feature of life in Bangkok. For many young Thais, 2020 has been a year of activism and protests. For the second consecutive weekend, thousands poured onto the streets demanding the resignation by Saturday of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha, an ultimatum he has ignored. Chan-o-cha is a former army chief who came to power in a coup d'etat 6 years ago. For the people out on the streets this weekend, he is a figure of hate. In 2017, he pushed through a new constitution that weakened the powers of parliament while strengthening the role of the military. But his resignation is not the protesters' only demand. They're also pushing for the right to criticise the royal family, currently a crime under the country's strict lèse-majesté laws. However, in recent years, the large periods of time the king has spent in Germany has raised eyebrows, and on Monday a group planned to march on the German embassy.
This protest is not about trying to overthrow the monarchy. We are just want the freedom to talk about anything. Yeah, just monarchy and just how to change Thailand.
Other demands include a new, more democratic constitution and an end to government harassment of its opponents.
You're watching live from Paris here on France 24. If you're just joining us, these are our top stories. Changing the constitution that was put in place under Augusto Pinochet. Chileans vote in favour of reform and call for greater equality in the country. Block roads, empty your bank accounts, strike. Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya calls for a day of nationwide action to increase pressure on President Alexander Lukashenko. And calling for the army to be brought in to set up field hospitals. The south of France hospitals there are struggling to cope with the number of patients with COVID-19 who require their care.